You've tried to explain it, you've seen the look on their face, and you already know how that conversation ends. There's something deeply frustrating about loving cars and being completely unable to make someone else understand why. Not because you lack the words, not because they're unintelligent, but because what's happening inside a car person's brain when they see a perfectly restored 1969 Camaro or hear a flat-six engine at full throttle. That experience is fundamentally untranslatable. And psychology can finally tell us exactly why. Here's what nobody talks about. The communication gap between car people and non-car people isn't a personality difference. It isn't a maturity thing. It is a neurological one. And once you understand what's actually happening in the brain of someone who loves cars, you'll never feel misunderstood or misunderstanding again. Let's start with something called the curse of knowledge. In 1990, a Stanford researcher named Elizabeth Newton ran a simple experiment. She asked one group of people to tap out the rhythm of a well-known song with their finger, and she asked another group to guess what song was being tapped. The tappers predicted that listeners would guess correctly about 50% of the time. The actual success rate? 2.5%. The tappers were stunned. They could hear the full song playing in their heads while they tapped. To them, it was obvious. To the listeners, it was just noise. That is exactly what happens when a car person tries to explain their passion. When you talk about the way a car pulls through a corner, or the specific timbre of a turbocharged engine spooling up, or the goosebumps you get the moment you hear a valve cover that was cast in 1972, you hear the music, they only hear the tapping. The knowledge is so deeply embedded in your experience that you can't unpack it into words that carry the same weight for someone who hasn't lived it. But the curse of knowledge is only half the story. The other half is even more interesting. There's a concept in psychology called object attachment theory. Humans don't just use objects, we bond with them. We project identity onto them. We grieve them when they're gone. And no object on Earth triggers this response quite like a car. Think about it. A car is often the first expensive thing you ever owned, the first place you felt truly independent, the first space that was entirely yours. You made decisions in that car. You fell in love in that car. You cried in that car at 2 a.m. with the engine running and the music up because you needed somewhere to exist without being watched. A car isn't a machine. It's a psychological container for some of the most formative moments of your life. Non-car people hear "I love my car" and they think you're talking about horsepower and resale value. But you're not. You're talking about identity. You're talking about the version of yourself that showed up when you got behind the wheel and felt, maybe for the first time, completely in control of where you were going. That is something you can't explain in a conversation. That's something you have to feel. Now here's where it gets really fascinating, and this part caught researchers off guard. Studies in neuroscience show that the brain of a car enthusiast activates differently when viewing a sports car compared to a non-enthusiast viewing the same image. The regions that light up, the same ones associated with seeing a human face. The brain, in certain passionate individuals, processes a beloved object as socially significant, not metaphorically, literally. The same neural circuitry that helps you read emotion and intention in a person's face gets recruited when a car person looks at a front grille, the curve of a fender, the aggressive stance of a stance-lowered coupe. You're not being irrational when you say a car has a personality. Your brain is genuinely perceiving one. And this creates an impossible translation problem. How do you explain to someone that you see a face when you look at a '67 Mustang? How do you explain that the sound of that engine doesn't just enter your ears, it lands somewhere behind your sternum and does something to you that you don't have a word for? You can't, because they're not perceiving what you're perceiving. Literally. This is also why car passion is so resistant to logic. Have you ever tried to justify a car purchase to a non-car person with numbers? You said things like reliability and resale value and performance to price ratio, and they still looked at you like you were insane. That's because you were using logic to defend something that was never built on logic in the first place. It was built on feeling, on memory, on dopamine and nostalgia and the primal human need to feel powerful and free. Speaking of dopamine, let's talk about what actually happens in your brain at a car meet, or the moment you find that perfect listing, or the day your build is finally finished.
Dopamine isn't the pleasure chemical. That's a common myth. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical. It's the molecule your brain releases in response to the pursuit of something rewarding. And car culture is an almost perfectly engineered dopamine delivery system. There's always another modification, another event, another dream car one step closer. The cycle never closes, which means the dopamine never stops. Non-car people don't have this loop running. They look at a car show and see a parking lot full of old vehicles. You walk into that same space and your nervous system lights up like a Christmas tree because your brain has spent years building a reward architecture around everything you're seeing. They're not cold. They're just not wired into the same loop. And here's the twist. The same thing that makes car passion so powerful is the exact thing that makes it impossible to share with words alone. Experience can't be compressed into explanation. You can tell someone what it feels like to push a rear-wheel drive car to its limit on a wet road and catch a slide with a flick of the steering wheel. You can describe it in the most vivid language imaginable, but until they've felt their own stomach drop and their hands react before their brain catches up, they have no file to store that information in. It bounces off. Not because they don't care, because they literally have nowhere to put it. This is the real answer, and this is what most car people never realize. You're not failing to explain it. The medium itself is failing you. Language was built to describe shared experience. When the experience hasn't been shared, language hits a wall. Every metaphor you try, every technical explanation, every passionate monologue about what a car represents, it's all a tapping finger, and they're waiting for a song that hasn't started yet.
So what do you do with this? You stop trying to convince people with words and you start inviting them into the experience. You don't explain what it feels like to ride in a fast car, you take them for a ride. You don't describe the community at a car meet, you bring them. You don't justify the emotional weight of your first car, you ask them about theirs. Because here's something almost nobody thinks about. Nearly everyone has a car memory. A road trip that changed something, a parking lot where something important happened, a drive they took alone when they needed to think. The difference between a car person and a non-car person isn't that one feels things around cars and the other doesn't. It's that one of them never stopped paying attention. Car culture isn't a niche interest. It's one of the oldest and most universal forms of human freedom. The open road as metaphor, the engine as heartbeat, the vehicle as vessel for every version of yourself you've ever needed to become. The non-car people in your life aren't missing the point. They just took a different road to the same feeling. And maybe, just maybe, the reason you can't explain your obsession isn't because it's too complicated. It's because some things were never meant to be explained, only driven.